Welcome to Berries in the Interim podcast, where we explore the cutting edge of innovative clinical trial design for the pharmaceutical and medical industries, and so much more. Let's dive in.
All right, welcome everybody back to In the Interim, Berry Consultants podcast of all things science in clinical trials, statistics in clinical trials, innovation in clinical trials. I have a really cool topic today. I will introduce the topic, but first I have really two very special guests. Dr. Mike Krams, a neurologist and senior medical scientist at Berry Consultants. Mike is a 30-year veteran of drug development in neurology, and even has been at Pfizer, Wyeth, J&J, and headed up quantitative sciences at J&J before joining Berry Consultants this year. So welcome, Mike. And interestingly for the topic today, Mike was really a driving force behind the creation of EPAD, an IMI-funded platform trial in Alzheimer's for that. And I'm also joined today by Dr. Husseini Manji, and we could spend our whole day with the accolades for Husseini. He is currently at Oxford University. He's co-chairing the UK government mental health mission. He's a professor at Oxford University. He is the past global therapeutic head for neuroscience at J&J, where he and Mike worked together there. Really interesting. So currently in academia, government work. He was at the NIH, where he headed up the NIH Mood and Anxiety Disorders Program, the largest program of its kind in the world. Also the Laboratory for Molecular Pathophysiology at the NIH. He's inducted into the National Academy of Medicine, has multiple prizes, but I thought this one was sort of interesting. He was one of the 14 inaugural health heroes by Oprah magazine. So welcome, Husseini.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and participate in this very timely discussion.
So what we thought we'd do today, a few episodes ago, we talked about the Healy ALS platform trial. That's a trial that's running 8 arms already in there. It's sort of full speed running in that. We thought we'd talk about the early stages of a potential platform where I think, Husseini, one of the things you're really interested now is precision medicine and psychiatry. Now, I know you were involved with J&J and esketamine, one of the first antidepressant in 30 years. So you've been down this road. So tell me your interest in precision medicine and psychiatry and what this platform trial could potentially, solve and be.
Great. I think that this is a very timely and exciting discussion. I'll just take a step back. You probably have a very broad and diverse audience, some of whom may be less familiar with the impact of serious mental illness. So I'll just take a moment about, the magnitude of the burden with serious mental illness, and then go into why I'm so excited about precision medicine and psychiatry. So I think mental illnesses really represent a significant global challenge with profound health, economic, and societal impact. One of the reasons they're so devastating is that by and large, they strike individuals relatively early in life, usually late adolescence or early adulthood, and they're lifelong. So they're the chronic diseases of the young. And not only do they cause direct pain and suffering, but they affect every aspect of people's lives, including physical health, social functioning, economic functioning, and academic performance. So there's a real need to come up with improved treatments for these conditions because, the unmet need is staggering. And yet, despite this unmet need, over the last few years, many large pharma companies have actually exited this space. And it's one could say it's actually a reasonable business decision on their part. And why I say that is that they've been concerned that compared to many other medical illnesses, these are very complex. And, it's not been as easy to come up with these precise target for a variety of reasons. One is that the brain really is the most complex organ we have, and it's relatively inaccessible compared to peripheral organs. So we do a lot with imaging, we do a lot with peripheral biomarkers, but you can't directly do a brain biopsy, so you've got to be, a little bit more indirect. Secondly, as you may well know, that the animal models don't translate very well into humans. And so we've got to sort of get into humans early on, and that could be one of the real advantages of this platform. The other thing to mention is that while they're amongst the most heritable of a lot of medical conditions, they arise of the inheritance of hundreds of susceptibility genes that interact with environmental factors. So there's no single driver mutation like there is in oncology. And then probably the most relevant for this discussion is that the nosology is based largely on a syndrome of subjectively determined criteria. So you basically ask people to tell you about their mood, their appetite, their energy, and so on. And there's almost no doubt that we put these labels like depression, bipolar, schizophrenia on a group of heterogeneous disorders. And so not surprisingly that if you take, heterogeneous groups of disorders and basically apply a broad label to them and take a one-size-fits-all approach to them, things don't work as well. And so that's why we're so excited about the idea of precision psychiatry. Can we really get to this, away from this one-size-fits-all approach? And similar to what's happened in areas like oncology in particular, can we start to move into more of a precision-based approach where we can use patient-specific information to basically divide the broader clinical population into subgroups that are more likely to respond to specific treatments. So rather than focusing on symptoms, behaviors, neurotransmitters, etc., we can start to look at illnesses based on their fundamental biology, neuronal circuits, other biology, and use that as a way to really get into some subgroups who may preferentially respond to different treatments. And that's where I think a lot of the advantages of what you and Mike are driving in terms of precision medicine, biomarker-based adaptive trials could be game-changing in this space.
Wow. Okay. So touched on a lot of things on this. So the number of platform trials have come out of patient organizations where they've recognized particular diseases are really hard to find successful things. It's hard drug development, it's expensive, low likelihood of success, but the need is there. And so this feels like a very similar situation. So there's still great need. Development is hard. Success is unlikely, small. There are huge challenges. And so a platform could potentially create easier ways in for drug development, potentially increase rates of success, lower the burden for shots on goal kind of thing. That sounds like a huge part of this. So let's think about what this, are you thinking this is not comparative effectiveness? So we're not looking at things already approved, healthcare, how they treat them. You're thinking about phase 2 type exploration is where multiple pharmaceutical drugs may come into this, that's kind of a sweet spot?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. So I strongly believe that's where the sweet spot is going to be. So there's actually been a lot of advances in neuroscience over the last 10 or 15 years. And so there are some novel and unprecedented targets to be interrogated. But as you alluded to, in all fields of medicine, about 90% of these things are going to fail, despite the best science, etc. So if you could have a platform trial where you could interrogate a number of these novel pathways, mechanisms, in these phase 2 type of clinical trials, etc., even failures, as sort of failing early is also very important. So you can redeploy resources to things that might be more successful. And as I said earlier, there's also a lot of reason to believe that while we've made a lot of advances in the science, these really are very heterogeneous groups of disorders. So even if you had, quote unquote, the right target, if you apply it to all comers, you're probably going to lose the signal. Whereas if you could apply it to a targeted population, then you'll really know whether it works or not. And again, based on the work you and others have done with biomarkers, would allow us to, move in this direction. I'll just mention one more thing related to your comment. So I think, in my opinion, it's absolutely correct that the sweet spot may well be sort of the phase 2 proof of concept trial types of trials. But there is reason to believe, so there's a lot of scientific data to suggest, just like in neurodegenerative disorders, in neuropsychiatric disorders, the immune system actually seems to play a major role. Once again, it's not going to be in all comers, but if you can identify people based on some sort of immune diathesis, they may respond to an immune-targeted drug. And the reason I'm bringing this up here is that there are a number of these drugs that have been developed for example, autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, psoriasis, etc., that may hit the right targets in terms of, say, IL-6, TNF-alpha, IL-12, 23, etc. So what we're thinking is that there may also be the possibility of using this for, approved drugs, but in a sort of repurposing approach, where we can sort of see with the neuroimmune being one of the best examples, I think.
Yeah. So in thinking about the precision aspect of this, in oncology, for example, there's the place the tumor exists, head and neck cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, but yet there are drugs that go after targets. And a drug may work across a span of these because it targets a particular aspect of tumors, regardless of where they are. Do you think that this might be similar, that it's not so much bipolar, it's not so much schizophrenia or depression, but it's somebody who is receptive to IL-6? So the platform might enroll a quite wide range of typical indications, if you will, but yet a single drug, IL-6 receptor antagonist or IL-23 or something, or autoimmune, might hit across a span of these, but only a subset of them that have the indication. Is that the notion here?
That's absolutely the notion. So again, if you look at sort of our current diagnostic classification for these disorders, and there's something called the DSM, it's basically a checklist of signs and symptoms. For example, if you look at depression, major depressive disorder, depressed mood, anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure, lack of motivation, lack of drive, sleep, appetite, energy. And yet many of these symptoms actually cut across many of our illnesses. So they're present in bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, etc. And what we've been trying to do as a field is exactly what you said, is try and match some of these symptom domains onto biology or pathology, so that the idea might be an IL-6 monoclonal antibody or IL-23, etc., could target the circuits, neuronal circuits responsible for these symptoms, whether we call you depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, and so on. And so there's something that's been, the term that has been used is transdiagnostic. And the very good news is that regulators, both the FDA and in the UK, we've been interacting with the MHRA, sort of get it. They understand that, sort of our old classification system probably isn't as conducive to coming up with novel treatments. So they're very willing to look at this transdiagnostic approach. Clearly, regulators need to see the evidence. They can't just take your word for it. But so, for example, there's a lot of interest in the possibility that if you could show that something works, for example, for this domain called anhedonia, which is very impairing, you could potentially get the approval to use it to treat anhedonia, whether your official diagnosis is major depressive disorder, bipolar, schizophrenia, and so on. So what you said is spot on. That's the way we're thinking about this.
All right, Mike, I'm going to go farther into design, but I feel like I have their stuff I've left out before I jump into more of what this could look like.
I think you have asked all the pertinent questions, and Husseini, it's a pleasure listening to you, and it's an even greater pleasure anticipating what type of future work there will be. So, Scott, keep going, and Husseini, keep going. Yeah.
I'm going to come back to you, Mike, and ask about thinking about, and I know Dr. Manji can answer this question, but pharmaceutical companies and their perception of such a thing, regulators. You know, the important stakeholders in all of these seem to be regulators, pharmaceutical companies, sites, and patients, and their perception of all of this. And if one of those breaks down, these tend not to work, even one. So we in I Spy 2, it was neoadjuvant breast cancer. They already broke the cancers up into hormone receptor status and HER2 status. We sort of recognized that these are different diseases. And it was also mammoprint status. But so drugs would come in, and the trial already looked for differential efficacy by those. We have GBM Agile is a trial looking at glioblastoma, where in that case, there are some strata that are broken up, but there a drug can come in and say, I'm interested in mutation X. Another drug might not care about mutation X. We have other trials that are trying to do precision medicine where largely they come in and they treat everybody. And then it's kind of data analysis after the fact, looking for heterogeneous treatment effect. What do you think a pharmaceutical company, or the drugs that are out there, are they going to be, is this the science has differentiated these diseases? It doesn't sound like that's the case, that there's a whole bunch of different potential drivers, that it may be the drug defines the heterogeneity in this case, or are we largely looking for it by treating everybody? What do you think the drugs out there are going to be, and what should the trial try to answer?
Yeah, so I think both things are very germane, and there are efforts which are looking at, sort of treating people with, a variety of drugs. So for example, when I was at the NIH, we did a trial of 4,000 depressed patients where they were sequentially treated with different modalities. If they didn't respond, they went on to this and so on. And a lot of biological information was collected, various kinds of omics, et cetera, to say, can we sort of see, what determines response to this modality of treatment, et cetera. But I think the former aspect you mentioned is actually going to be more exciting, prospectively saying, look, we have a drug that affects this neuroimmune cascade, or this hippocampal plasticity cascade, or, this sort of excitatory inhibitory balance, etc. We think it should work on this sort of subtype of people. Can we recruit those types of subtypes of patients and in fact demonstrate that this holds up? As you know, sort of companies, so one of the things about pharmaceutical companies is that I would say, probably 15 years ago or so, people wanted to treat all comers because you had a larger, population. Right. I think now there's a recognition that if you can treat a subgroup really well, and maybe your drug becomes the treatment of choice for that subgroup, that's actually pretty good. So pharmaceutical companies have gotten away from this notion of let's treat every depressed patient and hope for the best. So they're much more interested in subgroups. And so I think they would be more interested in the sort of notion that, okay, we think these sort of immune mediators, as an example, might work. Can we identify those people? And, I think we should come back in a moment to, what biomarkers are ready for prime time, if you will, in psychiatry, with those sort of biomarkers, and see if it holds up so that we can sort of say, yes, our drug is preferentially going to, treat these patients. As you know, one of the challenges in medication development is also getting payers to pay for medication because there's so many generic medication. So if you could show with data that using this biomarker, it really increased the probability of success that this population will respond, there's the possibility that the payers would be willing to say, okay, we'll give you a higher price because you're not going after all comers. you're going after this targeted subgroup. So that's, I think, where more of the action is going to be. Because a lot of what we're interested in, my group, is in the earlier phase studies, I think pharmaceutical companies would be very receptive to sort of putting a bunch of drugs from different companies into the same platform. When it's a late stage phase 3 asset, et cetera, they may be a little bit less willing to do that. But in the early phase, where this would hopefully be generating proof of concept, and if it works, you can go into your own phase 3 study. Maybe it might be under the auspices of this initiative. But I think they'd be willing to do that because of the markedly enhanced rigor, efficiency, speed that the platform trial would, bring to the table.
So a skeleton of what this could look like. So you have a number of sites, and it's there's a master protocol that defines some large level of inclusion-exclusion criteria.
Right.
You have the ability with a standard battery of biomarkers that you're probably looking, always the ability to add a biomarker as it's needed in that, but you've got a standard set of biomarkers. A drug, you'd be looking at a wide range of potential treatments. A drug would come in, we're thinking about this in phase 2. Some drugs could come in and they're actually interested in treating everybody.
Right.
It could potentially be, or they're interested in treating a subset by traditional indications, let's call it. But then a drug could come in, pharmaceutical company wants to treat those that have high or low biomarkers of a particular type. And they said, we would like to have our drug tested in that subgroup. They might be further looking for heterogeneous effects within that subgroup of those. And so one drug comes in and it's enrolling in all types. Other drugs come in and they're specific, and the potential patients in the trial are having a set of biomarkers done, which would create their ability to be included with any of the drugs. They're then randomized to these drugs or a placebo within that for those they're eligible for. We could largely have similar visit schedules and things collected on these patients within this master protocol. What kind of things seem to work or don't work with that?
So I think you've really captured things really well, and hopefully we can include you and Mike as consultants when we're designing things. So I'll just take a few of the very salient points you mentioned. So one of the things in the UK as part of this mental health, it's now called GOLDS program, used to be called Mission. We've set up this network of 15 clinical research sites throughout the UK to do basically exactly what you said. Sort of have this network so you can, both have large numbers of patients, everyone, following the same procedure for the patient evaluation, for the biomarker collection, et cetera. But I think what's also very important is that we also have this in the UK. Some of the sites we have are at what you might call the heavyweight sites, the Oxford, the Cambridge, the King's, the UCL, et cetera. But many of these sites are in areas where you have larger populations of individuals from different socioeconomic backgrounds, from different racial, ethnic backgrounds, et cetera. So you're basically also trying to get the information, if this thing works, does it actually work in general, or what population does it work in, et cetera? As part of that initiative, we have a major omics initiative where we're collecting saliva and plasma in particular. One of the challenges we have, as I mentioned earlier, is that while there's strong reasons to believe heritability plays a big role, these are genes of small effects, so you don't have the driver mutation. So you need to think more also about transcriptomics and metabolomics, et cetera. And as you know, whenever you're talking about measures that are more sensitive to change compared to sequence variants, they're more subject to noise. So you really have to standardize things, et cetera. One of the things in what we're trying to do is part of this thing called the Mental Health Goals Program is really emphasize that the biomarkers need to work in the trial but they need to work in the real world as well. And that's where we have one of the additional challenges in psychiatry is that we've done, I think, some phenomenal work with very sophisticated brain imaging, for example, fMRI with specific tasks or magnetoencephalography, etc. And you could do it in academic sites for the trials, but in the real world, someone in rural Alabama or in Nottingham, etc., is not going to go for those things. So these biomarkers have to be related to things that could be routine, inexpensive, accessible. So we're putting a lot of effort in terms of, even when we're trying to look at the brain imaging signature, try and relate it to a peripheral signature, which could be plasma, for example, saliva, or a digital signature, so that these things can be utilized widely. The other thing we're doing that other companies are doing as well is, for example, say you think someone might have a problem with hippocampal plasticity. There are some cognitive tests, for example, Mike would be very familiar with them, that you could do on a computerized battery and in your home. And that would tell you that you have this hippocampal plasticity impairment. Or with EEG, you can send these caps to people's homes who have these EEG leads connected to them, and you're using machine learning and artificial intelligence to gather the information from a single lead electrode. It's not going to be as precise as a 64 lead, EEG laboratory test, but it's good enough. So I think coming back to what you said, everything you said is spot on. I'll come back to placebo as well. So that's one of the other sort of challenges in psychiatry, is that patients with things like depression or anxiety disorders, we strongly believe that when you enroll someone in a study and you give them hope and you give them, first time in their lives, this thing has been explained to them and they're being supported regularly, etc., there tends to be a somewhat high placebo response. But I think placebo is driven by biology. And in the field of pain, that's been sort of borne out. So people respond to placebo in pain trials as well. And some studies have demonstrated that if you pre-treat someone with an opioid antagonist, you block the placebo response to pain, suggesting that you're basically actually releasing your endorphins, which are giving you the placebo response. So I think it's not far-fetched to think about the possibility that through this platform trial, there will be placebo responders. Can we even identify the signature that predicts a placebo responder? Because that would help companies a lot as well.
So awesome. So Mike, I'm going to turn to you with who could sponsor this? How do we, knocking down barriers, where do we go? And something I want to touch on that I think you talked about these biomarkers, the exploration. There's a lot of disease learnings. If you had multiple agents that came in here and you're doing these various biomarker analyses, you're looking for heterogeneous treatment effects. As more and more drugs come in, you have a huge resource to learn about the diseases themselves to move the disease forward. Meanwhile, you're also testing these drugs. You're creating a lower barrier for pharma to come in. They can take more shots on goals. This raises everybody in this. So, Mike, I know you went to the IMI. We created EPAD. We'll talk about some levels of success and aspects of this. Where do you go if this idea, this ideation is sort of there? Is this an academic funded thing? Is this a government funded thing? Should this be a nonprofit? Should it be a profit funded thing? A single pharma? Where do we go?
So the right answer to this, I think, has come out of all the experience that we already have with platform trials. I don't think the answer is this should be organized out of an individual pharma R&D sponsor, because there will be competing interests from one sponsor to the next. So that's not a good model. I think what's quite successful is the setup that we have, for instance, in GBM Agile, where a dedicated group outside of a pharma R&D company, but also not an academic group, but a very skilled group of integrators. I think that could work very well. Can I just add sort of the historical journey to this? You ask, who should we go to? I think we should go to patients, because patients would have more than anybody else an interest and a sense of urgency that there should be great advances in a reasonable time, as opposed to the inefficiencies that have been self-inflicted by unnecessary competitive perspective. So the patient perspective is clear. From an neuroscientist, scientist perspective and clinician's perspective, equally, everybody would want more efficient knowledge creation. And so the question is, how can we also encourage and convince sponsors within the pharma R&D world? And so, how much innovation is encouraged? And I want to tell about my own experience. Husseini, when you first hired me, you said, you know what, bite your tongue, be prepared, and get ready. And what happened was that you supported the writing of a proposal that eventually became an IMI proposal, and IMI EPAT came out of that, IMI EU Pearl came out of that, other things came out of that. None of that would have been possible without a champion who happened to be my boss within a pharma R&D organization. And I'm absolutely convinced there are parallel situations elsewhere. That's number one. Number two, our boss, Dr. Paul Stoffels, used a phrase saying, you take the risk, I take the blame. And that was an extraordinarily liberating statement, basically saying, hey guys, I want you to take risks. Again, I'm convinced that similar perspective exists everywhere across pharma. And so that begs the question then, now why is it that we are in such a conservative environment? Well, part of it is that the infrastructure that we've created is very myopic. You have compound development teams. Yeah. You don't have the team that solves the psychiatry patient problem, looking at the relevant pathway that's underlying different diseases. That's a problem, because the incentives that exist and the whole infrastructure is really organized by compound acid rather than biology. The other thing in the pharma R&D environment is everything is extremely timeline driven. And that lends itself, again, to a myopic perspective where we are rewarded for achieving something in the near term, but maybe that near-term achievement, starting a particular trial or having lots of patients included in a trial in a short period of time, are actually not really meaningful in helping us to get to the end game. And what it takes there are individual protagonists for innovation who bridge the gap between these pressures that exist, time pressures, budgetary pressures, the difficulty of synchronizing different utilities within an organization, and the invitation from senior management to be innovators. And one last point, in my experience, and again, supported by Husseini and others, all the interactions that I look back at with health authorities have been incredibly valuable learning experiences. So it is absolutely not the case that health authorities and regulatory experts are conservative by nature. Absolutely not. They have such an insight broadly that can help take the right path. So I would say the patient-centric perspective will lead us to bridge the gap around some challenges that exist, but the invitation is there to be innovators, and the type of GBM agile model that we have, I would think, is a good setup.
Great. Could I just comment on what Mike said?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, great. So I think Mike's comment sort of reinforced to me why we get along so well and why we're so much, we're mind melded, because everything he said I'd agree completely with, and I'll just amplify a few things. So as this, one of the key tenets as part of this UK Mental Health Goals program is actually a patient-industry partnership for exactly the reasons Mike mentioned. We want to embrace patients, learn from them, And, sometimes they tell you that, if you as a, medication developer might think this is the biggest unmet need. But actually, Prozac is okay for my depressed mood. It's my lack of motivation, my inability to go to work, etc. So to have the patient sort of educate, for lack of a better word, industry, this is what I really need. The second thing is that help industry sort of, talk to patients about, there might be some things that we know is a big problem for you today. And say, for example, COVID, induced a lot of what we call brain fog. But unless we, right now we don't even know what brain fog is, how to measure it, what the target would be. So it could be something we tackle down the road, but unfortunately today's science doesn't allow us to do it here. Coming back to what Mike said, and the patient advocacy, in conditions like HIV, AIDS, and many other conditions really drove things. Yeah. And we think that the same thing could be happening here. They can indicate that I'd be very happy to volunteer. What Mike said about regulators is completely my experience as well. So with Rob Califf, with Janet Woodcock, with June Rain, who was the head of MHRA, it's been exactly the same. They want to be, sort of more agile, get things to help patients, etc. They need to obviously have a bar for the evidence, but they're very willing to work with you. So the last thing I'd say is, once again, I would agree with Mike in terms of how this could be done. So I think some sort of, public-private partnership. So, you may know that ADNI, the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, was one of these great success stories where, we were able to collectively identify people who are on their way to dementia. And based on the rigor with which things were done, there's actually now a plasma marker, plasma 217-phosphatide, that is looking amazingly good. But you wouldn't have been able to come up with it unless you were able to have this large longitudinal study, etc. So we've got this initiative in the UK, and we're actually talking very closely to the French government, to the German government. And in fact, for many years while I was at J&J, I was the co-chair of the Foundation for the NIH Biomarkers Consortium, the neuroscience group. So I think there's a distinct possibility that, sort of if we frame this correctly, we can get both public and private, and most importantly, patient stakeholders to come together, from, the biopharma companies. Not everyone will join, but it's X number of join. Again, Mike referred to our boss, Paul Stoffels. One of the things he's really also championed is what's happening in the semiconductor industry, where things have moved forward so well that if you're not part of this consortium, you actually get left behind. Because all the advances happen here. So I think in industry, there may be some early movers. My hope is that companies like J&J and Lilly and BMS and AbbVie, et cetera, will join early. But then based on the success, others will want to join as well. And I think we can pull this off if we put the right people together and the right infrastructure. And the last thing I'll mention, and you don't want to overpromise. So I think that sometimes, what sort of is bad. People, say, claim we're going to cure world hunger with this. No, we're not. We're in an early stage. We need to think systematically, but this is how we'll go about it.
That's fantastic. It seems incredibly promising, seems very doable. And I think, Dr. Manji, you're the one to make this happen. So we hopefully will come back with some updates on what this effort looks like. And Husseini, I want to thank you tremendously for joining us here in the interim.
Well, it's really been my pleasure. I think that you can probably tell from my comments, I really do feel we're at an inflection point. And if we can come together as a society, we can make a real difference for patients, because unfortunately, the suffering today is staggering. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike, thank you very much.
Thank you.